There is a budget coming in October, and it's going to be painful. We have no other choice, given the situation that we're in. Those with the broadest shoulders should bear the heavier burden. Things are worse than we ever imagined. In the first few weeks, we discovered a £22 billion black hole in the public finances. The OBR did not know about it, and they didn't know because the last government hid it. And frankly, things will get worse before they get better. I won't shy away from making unpopular decisions now if it's the right thing for the country in the long term. We've done more in 7 weeks than the last government did in 7 years.
George, the key message of this speech was Keir Starmer saying things will get worse before they get better. What did you make of that as his first kind of big State of the Nation address?
I think the speech overall was consistent with the strategy Labour have had since entering power, which is we've inherited a terrible mess from the Conservatives. That strategy is very much influenced by the messaging David Cameron and George Osborne used after 2010, when they really pinned the blame for the financial crisis on overspending by Labour, suggested that the austerity they were introducing was unavoidable because of the mess they'd inherited. And this is a classic sort of narrative device throughout political history. You know, Margaret Thatcher often invoked the winter of discontent. And if you successfully entrench that narrative, it's an incredibly useful device because it means your opponents are always on the back foot because they can't change the past. And history is written by the victors, and that's what Labour is trying to do at the moment. But the line you pull out, I think, was an interesting one because there's certainly some in Labour, even some inside Number 10, who think that Keir Starmer might have overdone the gloom. It's one thing to say things are going to be tough, and clearly Starmer hinted at tax rises and cuts to come in the budget on October the 30th. It's another thing to say things are actually going to get worse under us before they get better. And that message seems slightly at odds with another line in his speech, which was, we've achieved more in 7 weeks than the Conservatives have in 7 years.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up that line as well because I was somewhat surprised by that. And I'm not saying that the Labour government hasn't had some big achievements in 7 weeks. I mean, they clearly had a plan for getting into government, hit the ground running, loads of really interesting cabinet and ministerial appointments that we've talked about, very quick pay deal with the junior doctors union and again on trains, and taking charge of the prisons crisis with a move to early release of prisoners, which is obviously very controversial, but at least it's doing something to solve this crisis. And lots of announcements on things like GB Energy. But I mean, 7 years ago was 2017. That was 4 Conservative prime ministers ago. That was Theresa May. Do you really think that it stacks up that they've done more in 7 weeks than in the last 7 years?
I think what you can say is that this has been the most active government with the clearest strategy throughout that period. I think all of the other prime ministers were, to different degrees, distracted by Brexit or in some way its legacy. Whereas I think this government's come in with a much bigger majority than any of those governments had, a much more united party, and a very developed agenda in terms of the King's speech had 40 bills in it. I think that was the highest number since 2005. Some of those are bills for largely political purposes. But as you say, there is a clear agenda here in terms of greater state intervention, expanding workers' rights, increasing climate investments, increasing onshore wind, and so on. So I think you can make a plausible argument that this Labour government is a lot more active than its predecessor. And in some ways, that's what you'd expect. Labour governments like to do things. They have a more interventionist view of the state. I think in some ways the bigger challenge, as I write in my column this week, is what do all of these policies collectively amount to? What is a Keir Starmer government for? Now, the slogan emblazoned on his lectern was "Fixing the Foundations," which is the same frame that Rachel Reeves has been using, which again gestures towards the crises they've inherited: NHS, social care, housing, and so on. But people are going to demand, what's the sort of positive difference you're going to make? And there is a risk that Labour appear the prisoners of Conservative austerity, as if the ghosts of the last Conservative governments are haunting them to the extent that they're finding it hard to break free of that. I think that's the challenge, because I don't think there's any doubt that people were incredibly tired of the Conservatives. That's why they did so badly at the last election. But they voted Labour to make a difference. So it's a fine line between saying we've inherited a mess and saying we really can't do that much about it.
Yeah, I sort of felt watching it that, okay, they're really hammering home that it's all the Conservatives' fault. Fine, that's very much what you'd expect, and it's their right to do that. But as you say, they were voted in to make things better. That was why a lot of people voted Labour, because they understood that the Conservatives had messed things up and they wanted an improvement. And I was waiting for the turn, as it were, the kind of optimism coming at the end, and it didn't really. I thought Keir Starmer did a good job of the way in which he invoked the riots and the civil disorder that we saw this summer, and wove that into his narrative about something being broken at the heart of British society. And there was a line in there where he talked about the rioters and the cracks in society after 14 years of failure. That's what we've inherited, not just an economic black hole, but a societal black hole. And I thought that was actually really powerful, evocative language to be able to look at the sense of alienation and disillusionment and frustration that led to those horrific scenes, and weave it in with a sense of lawlessness, not enough police, a low trust society, economic struggles, a sense that the government's not working for you, all of that. And I was like, great, more of that, please. But I didn't quite feel that there was a solution offered.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right to reference that section of the speech. I thought it was in many ways the strongest section, when he sort of juxtaposed the rioters with the ordinary decent people who got on with the clean-up the next day. And it was a sort of classic British coming together. And it's interesting, those are lines that some in Labour really thought Starmer should have used earlier after the riots, that he should have made a State of the Nation intervention of that kind sooner, because it clearly was a big moment. It's one historians will be writing about for years. Now the riots in a strange way feel quite distant. And there was this vacuum that emerged that was filled with rows over cronyism inside Number 10, rows over means testing of winter fuel payments. And it felt as if Labour had treated the riots very much as a law and order issue. And now it was time to move on. So Keir Starmer was right, I think, to bring the narrative back to the riots. But the speech ended up being defined by the things will get worse line. And I think then his reference to a painful budget to come. No, I think Labour's intent was clearly to soften up public expectation for tax rises, because I think they are worried. The Conservatives, the media will try to run with the line that, look, Labour's betrayed you. They didn't tell us about any of these tax rises during the election. They're trying to hoodwink you. Labour's aim is to really establish this narrative that, look, these are tough decisions, but we really had no choice because of the mess we've inherited.
Yeah, and he did a good job, I thought, of flagging, rather than trying to shy away from, two controversial and unpopular decisions that they have already made. One is on the winter fuel allowance, stopping it from being a universal benefit that goes to all pensioners and giving it only to the people receiving pension credit, so those who are the poorest in society. That's already caused lots of controversy, although, as I said on this podcast, economically, I think that makes a lot of logical sense. Other views are available. And then the early release of prisoners who have served around half of their sentence, which is necessary because the prisons are just full and there's dangerous overcrowding in them already. And if you want to have a very swift law and order response to the riots and have people arrested, charged, and up before a judge within days, which is what they did, you need somewhere to put them, you need prison places. But obviously, Keir Starmer, who I'm not sure if you remember, George, but he was Director of Public Prosecutions at some point in the past. But takes quite a tough line on law and order, and he was very, very clear in both the speech and the questions afterwards that he didn't want to let anyone out early, and this is a necessity because, as he said, you can't build a prison in 24 hours, and it's the failure of the Conservative governments over the years to build more prisons and have enough prison places while extending sentences that has led to that crisis. So you've got the justification for the controversial decisions already made, and I thought that was quite a convincing argument. We didn't want to do this. Here's the situation. So we have. Doesn't it get a lot harder, though, when it comes to the budget at the end of October, when Labour were very clear that in the manifesto and since that they are not going to increase income tax, national insurance or VAT, but that means that there's space sort of tinkering around the edges for raising revenue, and those taxes that they might be able to raise bring in less money and therefore have a sort of more distortive effect and could prove more controversial. Is it enough to just go, we didn't know about any of this, so here's a whole load of controversial stuff we're going to do at the end of autumn?
I think the public are expecting tax rises, and the economic situation was known about before the election, and I think the sort of public have a weary sense of realism about this, which is that, yes, we know they're not telling us all the tax rises they'll make now, but we know they'll have to make them, not least if you want public services to improve. I think a few challenges for Labour on tax. One is that basic political issue around trust. You're already seeing this in relation to winter fuel payments, people saying, look, that wasn't in the manifesto. The other is that, as you say, if you're not raising one of the big taxes, then you're often relying on smaller revenue raising measures. Those can get you into trouble. It's one reason George Osborne got into trouble with the omni-shambles budget, is that it was the pasty tax, it was the granny tax, it was the churches tax. So they'll need to be quite careful on the taxes they choose, and then the exact thresholds and so on. It's pretty clear they're going to do something on capital gains tax. It's pretty clear they'll do something perhaps around inheritance tax loopholes. They might look at higher council tax bans. These are all tax rises that are going to predominantly target the wealthiest. You saw that with Keir Starmer's reference to people with the broadest shoulders. So I think they'll be okay on that front as long as they stick to the letter of their pledges not to raise taxes on direct taxes on workers. The other problem, though, is that these, as you suggest, only raise you a few billion here, a few billion there. A few Labour grandees who have asked about this say they will find ways to raise money. But if you want to do something big, like sorting out the social care system, if you really want to build a lot more social housing, say, you really need to raise one of the big taxes. It just constrains your fiscal space, particularly if growth is not as high as you hope. At the moment, the economy is growing at its fastest rate for several years, but there's no guarantee that will last and that things will get better as quickly as Labour hopes. Things such as planning reform do take time to have an effect on economic growth.
I've heard some grumblings that if they just didn't stick with the 2p cut to national insurance that Jeremy Hunt announced in his last budget before the election, that would raise a huge amount of revenue. Or if you look at it the other way, that tax cut was hugely costly and was based on figures for departmental spending that the OBR described as essentially being fiction. And yes, at the time in March, Labour said the Conservatives are going to do this and will match it. But wouldn't there have been an opportunity over the summer with the look at the black hole, look at the OBR saying there's been more, £5 billion more borrowing than expected, look at the dire state of the public finances. The Conservatives couldn't afford to do this, and we would have liked to have done it too, but we can't afford to do it either, and we're going to put that money straight back into public services. Would that not have been a feasible way to sort of get one of those taxes raised without it looking like breaking a manifesto commitment?
There's some close to Labour who think they should have made this argument before the election, that they could have got away with that, and there's some who think they could still get away with it now. My sense is that Labour's neuroses about tax rises run so deep that they won't touch that. But as you say, I think there is a plausible argument. I think it's a difficult one for Labour to make when they've drawn so much attention to the cost of living crisis, and when they've talked about how economic conditions are still tough for working people. But it's worth, because the George Osborne comparison is made a lot, I think it's worth sort of digging into some of the differences as well as some of the similarities. I think there are a lot of rhetorical similarities in the language Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are using, but I think this Labour budget will still feel quite different to Conservative ones in that they're clearly going to rely a lot more on tax rises than cuts, because there isn't that much left to cut. And they're also making different choices in terms of the electoral groups they prioritise. Osborne protected all pensioner benefits and froze public sector pay. Rachel Reeves has essentially done the reverse, which is giving public sector workers real terms increases and cutting winter fuel payments. You might note that obviously Labour is much less popular among pensioners than the Conservatives are much more popular among public sector workers. So they'll be making political choices, I think, that reflect a very increasingly different voter base to the Conservatives.
So we've mentioned the more in 7 weeks than in 7 years, and one of the big claims from the Starmer speech was that he's ended the national strikes that have crippled our country for years. Obviously, pay deal with the junior doctors and pay deal with the train drivers, although pretty much as soon as that was announced, the union ASLEF announced further walkouts after a pay deal. Do you think he was jumping the gun by claiming victory for that? Is the issue of unions and public sector pay going to carry on haunting a Labour government?
I think the issue of pay will continue to be a divisive one, because obviously, although Labour's given them real terms increases, some have still had real terms pay cuts compared to 2010. Obviously, a lot hinges on what happens with inflation. On the rail strike, so this ASLEF dispute was a sort of separate one over working conditions, and I think that shows you a challenge that maybe there'll be fewer strikes over pay, but there may be more strikes over reform, because so far Labour are just trying to carry out a bit of a charm offensive with public sector workers, civil service, international partners actually, and say, look, we're much more conciliatory than the last lot. It's a bit of they're trying to have a bit of a honeymoon period and really change the whole mood music around government's relations with key groups. But if you listen quietly, they are still talking about public sector reform. They recognise that you're not simply going to be able to improve services by pouring more money in, not least because there's less money around than Labour would like. And so there will have to be, Louise Haig's team are quite clear. They want reform of the railways. They want to do it in consultation with the workforce and have a proper agreement. But there will need to be change. Similarly, Wes Streeting has been very clear about the reforms he wants to see in the NHS. This is something you saw under the last Labour government too, particularly when Tony Blair embarked on quite bold public sector reforms. This can cause discontent among the workforce, particularly if people still feel they're being underpaid for their jobs. So I think that's something to watch.
I want to talk very quickly about the sort of reaction that we had to the speech. Obviously, I reacted on the New Statesman website, and my verdict was it's a bit bleak, bit gloomy. Unsurprisingly, the Conservatives, not fans, who could have possibly guessed that? Rishi Sunak, haven't heard about him for a while, but he said the speech was the clearest indication of what Labour has been planning all along: raise your taxes. Kemi Badenoch said he was taking the British public for fools. He campaigned on promises he couldn't deliver, and now he's being found out. And James cleverly accused the Labour government of waging war on pensioners and said Starmer is now rolling out a series of dishonest policies for which he has no democratic mandate, for which my response is that's kind of what you'd expect them to say. And we're in the midst of a Tory leadership contest. No surprise there that they don't like it. What I did think was more interesting was Carla Denyer, the Greens co-leader, saying that enduring more economic pain and hardship isn't what people voted for. Labour needs to be honest about the fact that they could choose to make things better for everyone if they were bolder and braver. So pretty tough critique there from the left. Ed Davey, on the other hand, the Liberal Democrats, was kind of broadly supportive, basically saying the Tories left things in such a mess, kind of what do you expect? And I kind of think those dynamics are interesting because you'd expect the Conservatives to go as hard as possible on Labour betrayal. That's what they're going to do. But the difference in language from the Greens and the Lib Dems, challenging or being a little bit more sympathetic to Labour from the left, how much of an issue do you think those responses are? What do they tell us?
Yes, I think there is going to be space to challenge Labour from the left. They're not going to be as bold on taxation as some would like, although I think there may end up being more tax rises than some on the left expect. At the moment, we are just getting that somewhat Osborne-esque narrative on economic pain, but once you get to the budget, Labour may comes to be seen as quite a redistributive administration. You essentially are taxing wealthier voters, giving money to public sector workers. They will try and dismiss the Greens by saying that they're living in an economic fantasy land. Their spending commitments wouldn't add up. You can't just tax your way to growth. We've got to grow the economy. I think that's going to continue to be a key message for Labour. They know there are voters who have this negative perception that Labour will just tax and spend. They're not interested in wealth creation. It's a strong political line. The challenge is, can Labour actually deliver on it? With the Liberal Democrats, I think Ed Davey is going to take a more cautious approach because their new electoral heartlands are the blue wall, full of lots of former Conservative voters who are probably a bit more fiscally conservative, but who do want public services repaired. The Lib Dems' big issues are NHS, social care, and sewage, actually. And all of these do require more interventionist government. But you're not going to really see the Lib Dems outflanking Labour, particularly from the left, although they do oppose measures such as the two-child limit on benefits. So I think you're right to say, look, the budget isn't just a moment of decision for Labour. It's also the moment when the Liberal Democrats, who obviously now have over 70 MPs, decide on their political strategy for this Parliament. So this budget is going to be perhaps the most significant since George Osborne's in 2010, unless you include obviously quasi-Quatengs, which was politically consequential for quite different reasons.
Yes, I think the less we say about that, probably the better. George, fascinating stuff, and we will bring you lots more analysis of all of Labour's policies in the 2 months leading up to the budget and beyond.